In this video we're going to bench test a starter, and so I'm going to show you a couple of the tools we need and also the hookups so that you can determine whether or not the starter is in good shape before we put it on the car. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we're going to need is obviously a starter. So this is the starter here, and this one, if you remember from the lecture video, this one's actually kind of a small starter, so it's most likely going to be a permanent magnet starter on this one. And I wanted to show you what we're going to be doing for a bench test. Is on the solenoid up here, we've got three terminals. We got the S terminal right here, which is the starter, so that's the one coming from the ignition switch. We've got the B terminal, that's where the battery is going to be hooked up to. And then we have the M terminal, which is actually going down to the motor. So the easiest way to remember those is the M terminal is always going to be attached to the motor. So you see the wire there. The B terminal is also going to be a big one, like the M terminal is, but that's the one where the battery is. And the S terminal is going to be the small one. Some starters actually have another terminal over here that this one does not have. So you need, and it will be designated up here on the top of the solenoid as to whether or not it is the S terminal or another terminal. So that's what we're going to need for the starter. Another tool that I'm going to show you how to use is a remote starter switch. The remote starter switch is one of these little guys right here. You can pick them up just about any parts store. This one came from Mac Tools. And all they are is just, it's a giant push button switch right there, and with two connections on it. So when you connect these two to whatever you're connecting, you push that button and it closes the switch. So that's a remote starter switch. And then we're going to need a DVOM, which is right here. So the first check that we're going to do on the system, or on the starter, is we're going to check the solenoid to make sure the solenoid windings are in good shape. Now, you may or may not have to do this on the car. When it's on the car, it's a little more challenging because you got to get up to this terminal right here and you have to disconnect the wires from it before you can do this test. But what we're going to do is we're going to check for ohms across the starter terminal and the motor terminal, the M terminal. And so we're going to set our DVOM to read ohms. We're going to check the meter leads and make sure that we've got good connection on the meter leads, which it looks like we do, 0.0 or 0.1. Then we're going to just check it right here and right here. And you should see about half an ohm, which is about what we've got, so 0.5, 0.4. So that's good. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to chuck the starter in a vise, and then we're going to hook up a battery to this thing so that we can actually make it run. So I've got the starter in the vise now, and what you want to do is you want to chuck it into the vise on a part of the starter that it's not going to be damaged. So what I've done is I've clamped it on the other ear on the other side of the starter from here, and that way I'll bring you around to the other side here so you can see how I've got it clamped into the vise. And that way you're not going to damage the starter. It's nice and solid. It's not going to go anywhere. So that's what you want when you hook up when you put the starter in the vise. Now you are going to need to use the remote starter switch while the starter is in the car on a different task. So I'm going to show you how to hook that up. Because when I put this on in the car, it's really difficult to show it on the camera. So to hook up the remote starter switch, what you're going to do is you're going to put one lead on the B terminal and one lead on the S terminal. So if this was in the car, I would hook up one of the leads to the remote starter switch to the B terminal. The other one would go to the S terminal right there. Now if this was hooked up in the car, all I would have to do is hit the switch button here and the starter would engage. Now, a couple of precautions when you're using one of these remote starter switches. You always want to make sure that the key is turned off and preferably out of the ignition, because if the key is in the run position, when you hit this button right here, you'll start the car. So otherwise, if the key is not in the ignition at all, then when you hit this button, it'll turn the starter, but it won't start the engine. So that's just one of the precautions. What we're going to do for this test, though, is we're going to need to hook up a battery. And so what I've done is I've got the jumper battery, which is this little guy right here on the stand. This is different from a battery charger. It's not a battery charger. This is a jumper battery. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure it's turned off. And then I'm going to hook up the leads to it. So the red cable is going to be hooked up to the battery, the B terminal. And you want to make sure that this is not touching the starter. So one of the things you can do to kind of, if you're doing the bench test anyway, if you're doing this on the car, you don't need to hook up the battery. So doing the bench test, one of the things that you can do is use a rag to kind of insulate you. So what I've done is I've put a rag around the starter here, so that way what I can do is I can clip this on to the B terminal, and I don't have to worry about the clamp actually touching the case of the starter, because it's up against the rag. It's going to insulate it. Otherwise, if this touches the case of the starter, or on the starter, you're going to get a short circuit when you hook up the other piece. So you want to make sure that that doesn't happen. So I've got it insulated there, and I'm going to take the black wire and I'm going to hook it up right here on the other ear of the starter. That works just good because that's good ground and it's easy to clip onto. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hook up my remote starter gauge, or my remote starter switch. So the remote starter switch, and these wires, they can be, and it doesn't matter which one is which, you can actually just plug one of them onto the clamp here, and the other one can go to the S terminal. There again, you want to make sure that the S terminal does not touch this clamp. Everything has to be separated. Okay, and so now I've got everything hooked up. I've got my battery cable to the B, the red to the B. I've got the black to the ground. I've got one of my terminals to my remote starter switch right here on the positive, and I've got the other terminal to my remote starter switch on the S terminal. So now what I can do is I can turn on my battery, and you'll see the battery turn on because this light will light up when I turn the battery on. So I'm going to flick the battery on, and everything's ready to go. So now I've got it clamped in the vise, and all I have to do is push the button and this starter will operate. And so that way I know the starter is going to work when I put it in the car. I'm going to put this over here so you can see the drive gear on the starter. When a starter engages, what happens is this drive gear comes out and it starts spinning. So you can see it engage when you start it, or when you start the starter up. So anyway, that's a bench test on the starter drive. So